Welcome to this YoungMinds presentation, Enabling Resilience in Light of COVID-19, How Schools Can Foster Resilience in Pupils and Staff. This presentation sets out to explore some of the impacts of the pandemic on mental health of young people and staff. It will provide a reminder of what we mean by mental health and explore how we can foster resilience to help support everyone as we move forward through this challenging time. So first of all, let's have a look again at what we mean by mental health. So mental health is about the way that we think, that we feel, and we act. And as the definition on the screen explains, YoungMinds sees mental health as being about the strength and capacity of our minds to grow and develop, to be able to overcome difficulties and challenges and make the most of our abilities and opportunities. So this is a very asset-focused approach to mental health, and we really want to think about how we build the strength and capacity of young people's minds to help them make the most of the opportunities that are available to them, and to help them to overcome difficulties and challenges that they are going to encounter in their lifetime. So positive mental health for us is more than just the absence of illness. It's about that ability to really get on in life and to do well. But also we acknowledge that having a mental illness does not define who you are. So there will be times that we may experience moments of crisis of distress, and this can change over time. So even if we have a mental illness, it's not everything. Symptoms may come and go or even disappear completely. Other young people will experience ongoing feelings of distress and overwhelm that will last a long time or even continue over their lifetime. Some children and young people will receive a diagnosis of mental illness. Others will not, but they may still experience distress. And as adults working with young people, we can support our young people by helping them to articulate their feelings, to develop coping skills. We can provide them with opportunities to experience success. And all of these things will contribute to a positive sense of mental health. But what we need to do through this presentation is also explore and understand how our mental health has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's what we're going to look at now. So on your screen, you will see a list of fundamental components of mental health. All of these things are important to us having and maintaining a positive sense of mental health. So let's have a look at these each in turn and think about how the pandemic has impacted on each of these different components, and therefore help ourselves to understand why our young people may be struggling more now than they were doing before. So if we take the first one, relationships, and humans are naturally social creatures. We depend a lot on relationships to help us in every aspect of our life, and particularly to help us in managing our mental health. And of course, over the pandemic, our relationships have experienced significant disruptions. Young people have been separated from their friends, separated from other adults in their lives, and they've had to spend a lot more time in their home environment. And this has been really, really difficult. Those relationships have been suddenly disrupted. With no or very little warning, and very little ability to kind of do anything about it. And for adolescents in particular, this has been a time when they would have normally been gaining more independence and moving away from those relationships in the home towards those external relationships as they grow and develop. And a lot of that has been interrupted for children and young people over the last couple of years. So it's also about being able to regulate our emotions. Emotions are part of being human, and we experience ups and downs in our emotions. And we have to find ways to manage and regulate those emotions to enable us to cope. But of course, this has been made much harder because the things that we may choose to do have not been available. So in some cases, it's a case of being able to go to the gym, or it's getting out and getting some fresh air, it's getting some privacy or some time away, and all of those things have been interrupted. So for a significant period of time, the things that our children and young people would have relied upon to help them manage their emotions potentially were not available. And of course, the next one is about playing and learning. And we know that there has been significant disruption to both access to leisure activities and access to education over this time. And play and leisure activities are also critical in terms of regulating emotions, in terms of growing, in terms of developing. And obviously learning and being involved in education is a critical part of what we do and who we are. And it provides so many benefits for our children and young people, and the disruption that they are facing and have faced has had a significant impact. And then if we look at this idea of being able to tell right from wrong, so we need to be able to tell right from wrong so that we can fit in with society, so that we can work within the bounds, and that we can develop cooperative relationships, because those are based on this fundamental understanding of right from wrong. But during the pandemic, there's been a huge amount of uncertainty at times as to what the rules even are. They've changed frequently. They've been different in different areas. They've been different in different settings. There's been a huge amount of confusion. And there's also been a lot of conflict between perhaps what the government is telling us to do and what your family feels is acceptable, what your friends feel is acceptable, because there's been a large element of having to make personal assessments of risk and choice about what we're going to do, what activities we're going to take part in, where we're going to go, how we're going to manage that, what is going to help us to feel safe. So perhaps we may see young people where their families have been very averse to risks and have tried to isolate themselves even perhaps more than they needed to, whereas a young person's friends might have been more willing to go out there and do what they were allowed to do. And of course, that's going to cause conflict and tension for our young people. And then finally, we're looking at this idea of a clear sense of identity and self-worth as being important to our mental health. Because we can only have a positive sense of mental health if we have a clear idea of who we are, and we feel that we have value. And for a lot of young people, the future has felt very uncertain. They're not really quite sure what's going to happen. Normal rites of passage have been missed. And these sorts of things are very important in developing self-worth. And so, of course, this element of our mental health has been affected as well. So you can start to see from the things we're talking about why perhaps young people have been struggling with the pandemic and how specifically it's impacted on their mental health. And of course, the question that might be in your head is, well, how much of a difference has all of this made? We hear a lot about our children and young people and their mental health and how it has been affected by the pandemic. But how much has it actually been affected? So what we've got here are some statistics that have come from the NHS prevalence study around mental health in young people. So we've got two figures on here. So this is a study that is done regularly across the country involving large samples of young people. So the first figure on there is from 2017, and that it says that 1 in 9 6 to 16-year-olds had a probable mental health disorder. By 2021, that's increased to 1 in 6 6 to 16-year-olds with a probable mental health disorder. So by a probable mental health disorder, what we mean is that if those young people were to be assessed, they would likely receive a diagnosis of a mental health disorder. So that's what it's looking at in this particular study. The increase that you can see that's happened between 2017 and 2021 was actually first observed in 2020 and has remained then broadly stable between 2020 and 2021. So what we're seeing is perhaps a longer term increase in mental health issues amongst our young people as opposed to a short-term response. Although, of course, the pandemic is still happening and still going on. So we don't know how much of this will reduce for our children and young people once things start to return to more like normality and the pandemic hopefully wanes away. So that's what the statistics are telling us. And what we're hearing from schools in terms of the impact on the children and young people that they are working with is that There are particular groups that are struggling, and there's certain trends and themes that they have noticed. So those in transition years are especially vulnerable. We've had lots of reports from schools that those children are less mature, so particularly that transition from primary to secondary, if we're thinking about that group, they're finding it harder to make that transition. It's taking them longer to establish their new friendships, and it's taking them longer to adjust to the new freedoms and responsibilities that come with secondary school. So they're finding that much harder. Some of the pupils have been seen to have less stamina. They've been getting more tired more quickly, so really struggling with getting back into full-time learning at school. Other pupils have struggled with readjusting to the social interaction. So they've actually found it really kind of quite hard to get back into that. In contrast to that, we have also heard that some young people, have really been missing that social interaction and have thoroughly enjoyed being back in the school environment and being able to experience that again. So they're looking for any chance to gain social interaction. We've also heard that for some pupils, the relaxation of rules has led to anxiety. And for some young people have been too anxious to even return to school in the first place, or there's been high levels of absenteeism. And of course, pupils have been feeling that they've lost a lot of control and choice. So all the uncertainty has made things very hard for them. As we mentioned previously as well, some of the pupils have really struggled with missing out on various rites of passage, such as school leaving events. Others have found that when they had teacher assessed grades, it feels like they hadn't really earned them because it wasn't the same as sitting in an exam, and a feeling that it wasn't going to be taken, their results weren't going to be taken seriously. So these are the sorts of things that we're hearing from schools about the things that are affecting the children and young people in their schools and the way that they are struggling and what they're struggling with. And then we also reached out and asked young people what was going on for them. So how has all of this impacted them? So YoungMinds conducted a number of coronavirus surveys throughout the pandemic. The most recent one was in January this year, when we were obviously still in lockdown. And at that point, 67% of young people surveyed believed that the pandemic would have a long-term negative effect on their mental health. And they identified 4 factors as having the biggest impact. So loneliness and isolation. So really, really struggling with that sense of being isolated, the lack of social contact. Concerns about school, college, or university work. So keeping up with the work, meeting the expectations, being where they needed to be, the pressures to catch up or the feeling that they're missing out. There was also concern about somebody they know getting ill. And one of the interesting things about these surveys is that young people were typically more worried about other people getting ill than themselves. And finally, not being able to get the mental health support that they needed. So young people have told us that it's been harder to access the support that they need, or that the support that they need isn't able to be offered in a way that they feel comfortable accessing it. So we might assume that young people would be perfectly comfortable with accessing the support they need over the internet or via the phone. But actually, for some young people, this just doesn't work. It doesn't have the same effect, or they feel that they don't have the space and the privacy to be able to actually access that. So they've struggled around getting support. We also asked them about what was going well and what helped them and what was positive for them. And this is what they told us as well, that school and work often provided a routine and it kept them accountable. So it kept them going. For some young people, the flexibility of being at home was preferable. So we already know that some young people do struggle with being in the school environment. And actually, when the pressure was taken off and they didn't have to get up and go out to school and manage all of the different aspects of school life, that it was actually better for them. And other young people were actually able to develop and implement positive coping strategies over time, which actually helped them to manage their mental health better. So they had the opportunity to really think about those strategies and try out things and find what worked for them. So of course, that has been really positive as well. So we're going to move on now in this presentation to start thinking about resilience. And resilience is one of those words that we hear all the time. But it's really helpful to actually start to pick apart not only what do we mean by resilience, but how do we achieve resilience? How do we become resilient? What builds our resilience? So most of you, if I was to ask you, would tell me that resilience is about bouncing back, it's about coping with challenges, it's about getting on with things. And you would be exactly right in that. That is a large part of what resilience is. So it is about helping us to deal with challenges that come our way. It's about allowing us to learn from past experiences, and it's about how do we make the most of our abilities and opportunities. So the more resilient we are, the more we're able to do those things. And another way that we could understand resilience is that it's the ability to do better than might be expected in the face of adversity. And I think that's really picked out in this quote that we've got on the screen about this idea of being strengthened by and even transformed by life's adversities and challenges. The other thing about this quote, which I think is really important to hold on to, and the quote is by Anne Maston, is that resilience is a complex relationship of psychological inner strengths and environmental social supports. And this is a really key aspect of the work that we do at YoungMinds around resilience. So resilience is more than just our internal strengths or an inner trait that we have or we don't have. Resilience both comes from those psychological inner strengths, which can be developed, but it also comes from having access to environmental social supports, and it's that combination. And what we know is that when both those internal resources and external resources are there, resilience happens. It's an ordinary adaptation. We become resilient if the resources are in place. And that's how we can help our children and young people to develop resilience. It's about ensuring that they have access to the things they need most. So that combination of internal support and external supports. Bring them together and we will see resilience. So what we're going to do now is start to explore the things that help us to build resilience. And we're going to do that by doing a little exercise, because the first step towards understanding and promoting resilience is to recognize the resources that we already have and the important part that they play in our lives. So take a moment and reflect. When you've had a long, hard day at work, how do you cope with it? What do you do? What things do you turn to? So up on the screen now are some of the answers that we get given in our training room. And there might be some things on there that resonate with you, that stand out to you. There might be some things on there that you wouldn't do. It wouldn't help you at all. But these are the sorts of things that we get told. So I suppose the question is, what does this tell us about resilience and how can we use this information? So if we look at the things on the screen or we think about the things that we do, firstly, let's have a think about a time that we couldn't do those things. It's likely, probably over the last couple of years, that access to one or more of the things that you like to do to relax has been restricted or affected in some way. And if it hasn't, maybe just use your imagination and think about how it might feel. What we tend to hear from people when we ask this question is that we quickly start to feel stressed. We feel maybe anxious. We become less tolerant of others. We might start to struggle to sleep. We might become more easily irritated. We quickly see changes in our mood and how we feel and our attitude, and lots of things are affected very quickly when these things aren't available to us. So how does this relate to resilience and the work that we do with young people. So the one thing we can take from this is how important these activities are. Okay. And then we can start to think about, well, what is it that helps young people? Okay, so what we did is we asked young people, what is it that helps you when things are tough? And these are the things that they came up with. They're surprisingly similar to what adults said. Okay, and that's really interesting in and of itself, because a lot of adults, if we ask them this question, will immediately say, well, young people use social media and they do gaming or they play on computers. That's how they relax. But actually, those weren't the most important activities to the young people we spoke to. Okay, so lesson number one that we can take from this exercise is that we should talk to young people and we find out what helps them. Once we've found out what helps them, we can encourage them to notice how certain activities make them feel. And this can really help them to identify the things that actually make a difference that they can use when things are tough. Okay, so actually some young people might automatically say social media or gaming, but when they sit and they think about it and they really start to notice, they may notice that the things they thought helped didn't help. So it's really important that they spend some time doing that reflection on what actually helps. So we also need to note that when we're feeling under pressure or at busy times in our lives, we often push these things to one side because we don't have time or we don't feel like it. We're feeling tired and we're feeling stressed. So we just don't want to do the exercise or we don't want to talk to anybody at that particular time. But actually, these are the times we need to do these things the most. So if we recognize the importance of them and how it makes us feel when we can't do them, we can encourage young people to take the time to do them so that they can manage better and they can keep those things going. So perhaps, you know, at those times when they've got exams coming up, you just start dropping in there. Don't forget to take some time out. Conversations are really, really helpful. The last thing I suppose we need to recognize with this is that these things are incredibly important and helpful in maintaining and regulating our mental health, but they aren't the solution to everything. Sometimes it's going to take more than these things. And as adults, we need to be kind of sensitive when we're suggesting these activities in response to a young person that's experiencing distress. So just thinking carefully through what we're going to say to a young person when we're making these suggestions. And it's actually best to have these conversations potentially before they're experiencing distress so that they can keep doing these things and recognize the importance and build them into their routine and do them regularly as well. These things work much better if they're doing them regularly than it does to kind of insert those things later on when a young person is struggling. So we do need to be sensitive when talking about these activities to young people. And that leads us into really the next question is, well, what do we do when those things aren't enough? Or how can we make sure that we do build those things in? And the first thing we're going to think about is how do we create then the environment that connects children and young people to the wider resources that they're going to need to build their resilience. So I guess what we've just talked about is some of those internal things that we can do, those things that we know that help, things we can do to take care of ourselves. But we know that it takes more than that to be resilient. So we need to build an environment that connects our children to the wider resources they're going to need. And we know that the more able they are to cope with life's challenges, the better the chance of them being able to maintain positive mental health is. And to help us in planning this and thinking about which strategies we need to put in place, we need to first understand which pupils is it that worry us the most and why. And we also need to be conscious that mental health distress can arise in anyone, and it's not always the ones who we would traditionally be concerned about that struggle. So we're going to just take a minute to reflect on these questions then. So when we ask this in the training room, we say to people, okay, so which are the pupils that concern you the most and why? And generally, the ones that concern us the most are quite obvious. We know that they're struggling. They're usually already known to staff, and they're usually receiving a lot of support. And quite rightly, we are concerned about those pupils and their well-being and things going forward for them. So those might be the young people who've had lots of challenges in school, have difficulty with friendships, are struggling even to attend to school. Maybe the ones that don't get any support at home. All of those things might put a pupil on that list of the ones that concern you. And the next question on there is about, are we worried about the same pupils as before the pandemic, or has there been any changes? So from other schools that we've spoken to, what we've heard is that the children who are doing really well are, or the ones that we would hope were doing really well, are actually now struggling because they've not had the support that they need during the pandemic. Perhaps they've got two working parents who've been really, really busy and really challenged by having to have the children at home and work, and trying to manage difficult, pressured jobs at the same time. So they've not had the support. It might be that we've seen those that have done really well out of school, but are now struggling because they're back at school. We might also see some pupils who were in school because they were vulnerable, who benefited hugely from schools being closed because they had more attention from pupils, from parents. There was less stuff going on in the school, so they benefited massively from that, and now they're struggling. And the final question that we ask in the training room is, are there any pupils that are at risk of being missed, risk of not being picked up and not being offered the support that they need? And in busy schools where there's huge numbers of pupils, this is quite likely. And the other thing that makes it quite likely is that some people respond to difficulties by keeping their head down, by being very compliant, by getting on with what is needed. And so academically, you may have pupils who are doing absolutely fine, but they're still struggling underneath it all. And these pupils present quite a risk and present quite a difficulty to manage. So what we're going to talk about in a minute is how we can put in place things and approaches within our school environment that can help to mean that those pupils who might otherwise be missed have still got access to the things they need, have got the opportunities to be connected to the resources without us necessarily being aware that they're struggling. And that can make a massive difference to those pupils as well. So what I'm going to introduce you to is something called the resilience framework. And this is something that we use a lot at YoungMinds when we're doing our work with schools. And it's based on the work of Angie Hart and Derek Blinko. And what it attempts to do is to bring together all of the things that we know, and there is evidence to support the idea that these things will help build resilience. So that's what this document is about. There's a few things we need to know about resilience before we can use this document effectively. So there's a few key things we need to know. So the first is that resilience is not infinite. So even the most seemingly resilient person will struggle in the face of overwhelming adversity. And it also means that some of the children and young people that you might be working with are using all their resilience resources just to turn up at school in the morning. And that when they therefore get to school, they haven't got a lot left to give. And therefore they may appear that they're not being that resilient, but actually it's taken everything they've got to get to school in the morning. And that's just the way it is at this point. So we need to carry on topping up that resilience for those children. As we've already said, resilience building is not just about individual skills. So some of the things on here are, developing coping skills and problem solving skills. Absolutely, we can teach those things. But a lot of them are not necessarily just about things that you have inside yourself. It's about being able to connect to other resources. And our levels of resilience are going to change over time. So, you know, within schools, we see this quite often. So a child struggles, we connect them to an intervention. They do well, and so we end the intervention, and then they struggle again. Because the resource that they were relying on that was enabling them to cope is no longer there. So we need to think about that as well. We need to think about changes in the level of resilience and how we can maintain it. How can we connect them to something that can be maintained? Okay, so I'll explain to you how the framework works, and then we're going to look at how we actually use it and different ways that we can use it. So along the bottom, you will see something that's called the Noble Truths, and there's 4 of them, and these are the underpinning principles of good resilience building. So firstly, it's about accepting. And what we mean by this is it's accepting the young person for where they are right now, coming alongside them and starting where they are, not worrying so much about where we want them to be, but where are they right now? It's also about accepting the limitations of our role. We can't do everything for everyone, and depending on our role, we may not have influence over certain things. So one example of that would be on this list, we've got good enough housing. Within the school setting, you've probably got very little opportunity or influence over where your pupils live. But what you are able to do is ensure that when they come into school, the environments that they are in are warm, welcoming, and adequate for their needs. So we can tackle it in that kind of way as well. So it's thinking about it slightly more broadly. If you think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me, just do that double check, see if you can translate it into the setting that you're in. But if you really genuinely can't help those young people with that particular element of it, that's also absolutely fine. It's about conserving the positive things that are going on. So what is going well in your school, and keep that going? What is going well for that individual young person, and keep that going? So perhaps a child has a particularly good relationship with a certain adult in the school. So actually, if we can facilitate that relationship, that's going to really, really help. So let's build on what we've got already. It's about being committed. So it's about committing to doing one more thing. That's one way of looking at it. Okay. What is one more thing I can do to add to that resilience pot, to help those children, young people in my school, or that individual? And it's also about enlisting. So reaching out and connecting like I say, individual children or your school to other resources, using what is available to meet those needs. So we can use this document in a few different ways. And one of the ways that we can use it is individually with a young person to build their resilience. Now, the key to using this with an individual young person is ensuring that we remain asset focused. So what doesn't work with this approach is if we sit down with a young person and we go, okay, well, you've got these ones, you haven't got these ones, so we're going to fill in the gaps, and then you will therefore be resilient. It's not about trying to tick off everything on this and then you will have a resilient child. It is about all of these things and how they can contribute to resilience. Okay, so that's the slight difference with this. It's not about having to tick them all off. You may not be able to tick them all off. We can't make sure that everybody has enough money. We can't make sure that everybody has a good enough house. With little influence over how much sleep our children and young people have. So there are things on here we can't do, but it's more about focusing on what we can do. And it's about working with what we've got. So what is that child or young person good at? And how can we use that? And to give you an example, when I was doing some work with a school, we were talking about a particular young boy who was really having a lot of challenges at school, a lot of difficulties around anger management, really struggling to engage, essentially on the verge of potential exclusion, and they didn't know what to do with him. So we looked at this document and we talked about resilience, and we started talking about what he was good at. And eventually where we got to was that his one strength that they could see was that he was good at talking to adults. He was funny and he was likable and he was articulate. So that was the starting point. And after a lot of discussion, we decided that one thing they could try with him was to use that strength, and they were going to allow him to show prospective parents around the school. And it took such a long time to get to that point because this little boy really did have a lot of challenges. But you can immediately see that by taking that approach and using what he was good at, and giving him that opportunity, he was going to get so many of these things. He was going to access so many of these resources. So it was going to tap into his sense of belonging. It was going to give him some responsibility. It was going to foster his talents. It was going to help him be brave. It was going to instill a sense of hope. It was going to highlight his achievements. It was going to bring in on board so many of those resilience components for this young child. And that is how this document works best, if you're using it in that sense of an individual young person. So we also can use this document to assess what our school is offering and think about, what are we doing really well at? What are we doing okay at? And what are we not doing at all? And that can help to start to form then a plan of what you might want to do in your school, how you can kind of make changes. So let's have a look at that idea. And what we call that is resilient moves. And there's 3 types of resilient moves. So there's the one that we've just talked about, that direct intervention with a child or a young person. So when we take an action that directly involves that young person and builds their resilience. So an example of that might be social skills support for a young person who's struggling with that aspect of school. Okay, so we do some social skills work with them. We're helping to build their resilience because we're going to help to improve their chances of making good relationships. Okay, so but we can then add to that. So we can do a complementary change. We're also looking at things that are going to change the behavior of adults that might help. So we could also train the lunchtime staff in the strategies that we give the children in the social skills group, so that they can support the pupils and reinforce the messages and help them to use and utilize those skills. And then on top of that, what we can also look at is making resilient moves that involve a change to a system or process. So that's where we look at what we're doing, and we're either thinking about breaking down barriers or introducing new systems that mean that more of our pupils can access the things that they need. So in this case, we could think about developing a relationship policy in collaboration with our pupils that sets out how everybody in the school should relate to each other. And that's going to also support that direct intervention and the change in the adult behaviour, and it's going to bring it all together. So that's how resilient moves work. So it's thinking about those 3 different aspects and how we can bring them together to make the strongest move possible. So rather than just putting it on the child or young person, think about the other elements as well. And we do understand that at the moment in schools, things are really tough, and there might not be much capacity for big change or much ability to take those things on board and make big changes across your school. But the really interesting thing that we can do is think about some small things that we can do. Okay, so small changes, if they're the right changes, can be just as effective. So it's not about taking down what you're already doing. It might be about tweaking what you're doing or building on something you're already doing. We've also highlighted a few things that you might like to focus on at this particular time. So we know that relationships are key to positive mental health. And so this might be an area that's really good to focus on at the moment, particularly because relationships have experienced so much disruption. So thinking about creating consistent relationships with an adult. Ideally, each young person in the school has a key adult who can provide that consistent relationship. Wherever possible, if we can give the children and young people choice in who that relationship is with, that's fantastic. Okay, so, for example, you might think about setting up a mentor system so that every pupil is connected with an adult who can meet with them regularly and check in on how they're doing. Now, it might be that setting that up is a little bit too much at the moment. So in which case, use the processes that you already have in place. So what you have in the way of registrations, what you have in the way of tutors, how can you provide that relationship? How can you just maybe shift the focus of that relationship to one that is prioritizing mental health and well-being and connection and building those things in? Okay. We can also use the idea of creating simple routines and rituals to build that sense of connection and a sense of belonging. So, what is the process for your children when they come into school? What's the process at the end of the day? How do we transition them into and out of school? How do we make that something that's consistent, something that's reliable, something that helps with that transition from home to school? Okay. We've got play and fun on there. Okay, so play is a great way to diffuse feelings and tension. It helps young people to process. So think about, what space is there for fun and lightness in the relationship, and fun and lightness within the school day? How can we bring that joy into what's going on? And finally, think about how we can introduce a sense of control. And a really good way of doing this is just simply to talk to the pupils about what they need and what they think would help them. So reach out to them, give them some control, involve them in the solutions, and you'll find that they're much more effective. So we also reached out to some of the schools who sit on our Teacher Insight group, and we asked them what they've been doing to respond to the pandemic. So one of the schools has increased their pupil voice. So they now have a huge range of pupil groups that cover a massive range of issues that affect pupils' school lives, but also their wider lives. So they have groups that work on race, they have groups that work on gender issues, they have groups that work on LGBTQ+ issues. They have groups that are working on climate change. They have groups that are working on diet and nutrition. And those groups meet regularly. They look at the issues and they come up with solutions that can be implemented within the school community, or things that they can take forward on a wider basis. And that's a really great way of giving pupils back a sense of control over the things that matter to them most in a really positive and constructive way. And they found that that's been very popular with their pupils. Another school spoke to us about their pop-up events. So they had really noticed that the media narrative around mental health was quite negative, and they wanted to do something to counter that. So they have had smoothie making, and they've had mindfulness activities where they've got the pupils involved in setting up events, but there's also been the space and the time to talk about how they can positively manage their mental health rather than it being a very negative rhetoric. One school, their pupils had really missed the social activities and social interaction that occurs through school, and what they wanted the most was an increase in clubs and trips and enrichment activities. So they've really gone all out with increasing that, and they've increased the number of clubs and things so that everybody can find that opportunity to develop those social skills and social interactions. One of the other schools had extended their PSHE to include their sixth form. They met quite a bit of resistance to start with, but now the pupils are saying that they really value that time to talk about the things that matter to them most and have the chance to explore some of this stuff. And finally, thinking about kind of parental engagement. So the school had got a lot more engagement by using online platforms over the period of the pandemic, and they've kept all of that going and found that that's been really helpful and supportive for their pupils to be able to keep those relationships going. So there's some really positive stuff that's going on around in different schools in terms of responding to the pandemic. So some of these things might be things you could take forward, but also just to give you an idea about lots of opportunities and things that are going on. And we like to hold on to the positives here at Young Minds. So this is an exercise that you could potentially do with your pupils, and really thinking about, builds on that idea about there being quite a lot of negative rhetoric. So what have your pupils gained over lockdown? What have they learned? What challenges have they overcome? And how can they use those things going forward? You know, so some people have told us that, you know, they've learned to cook, they've learned to use a washing machine, they've actually become more organized or more motivated. They might have developed better relationships with their families because they've spent more time with them. So really thinking about what are those assets, what can they then hold on to going forward, what have they learned? So that's a really nice dialogue to have with pupils. And finally, what we wanted to do was to talk about staff resilience. So we recognise that it has been incredibly hard for school staff over the past couple of years. We know that there's issues with absence and sickness and other COVID-related reasons, the ongoing anxiety about being in an environment that you can't get out of, and there's COVID rising COVID numbers and reductions in restrictions, and of course none of these things can be easily or quickly fixed. So the question really for schools is, well, what actions can we take to help staff cope through the challenges? And I think it's the same as for the children and young people. The best thing to do is to reach out as a staff team and work collaboratively to find the most effective way, what is most important for your staff right now. And it will vary from school to school because all schools are very, very different. So what is the biggest priority for your staff team? So it might be that you need to implement new systems to make sure that people have got somebody to talk to. It might be that you need to implement new supervision. It might be that you just need to find a way of making sure that staff get a break. It might be that you need to put some projects on the back burner. And we've got a tool here that might help you start those discussions. So this is something that's been developed for schools. And you might want to do it on your own, or you might want to do it in, as a group, and a team meeting, as a way of thinking about which of these are going on for us, which do we do, which do we not do, which ones do we really want to improve. So you can take the time to work through this, and then it provides a really good starting point for those discussions. And then you can set yourself some goals as to, okay, I will really want to improve this in the next month, and then I'm going to come back and think about it. Or as like I said, as a staff team, actually we're going to prioritize the fact that everybody's going to get a lunch break. And that's what we're going to do over the next month, and we're going to see how that helps. So it's something you might want to use to start. And so we're coming to the end of this presentation, and in summary, I just wanted to highlight a few key points. So focus on creating a sense of consistency and belonging. Make time for those relationships. Make time to get to know your pupils. Encourage and facilitate play and leisure. And then finally, look after yourself and your colleagues. And if you'd like any more from Young Minds, you are welcome to have a look onto our website. So we've got some academic resilience resources that you can download for free, which talks much more about the whole school implementation of this approach. You can also join our 360 school communities and have free resources emailed to you on a regular basis.